Hello and welcome to today's LitheSpeed webinar. Hope everyone's having a great day. We'll be exploring an Agile team roadmap with LitheSpeed Managing Agile Consultant and Lean Startup Expert, Pete Oliver-Krueger. Just to make sure everyone can hear and we've hit all the right buttons, if you could say where you're from in the chat box, and I'll wait for a couple of those to make sure I'm not talking to myself only. There we go, Danielle, Phoenix. I'm in Tucson, Arizona, so great day for us today. Very sunny weather, as always. We've got Ann from New Jersey, Paula from Santa Barbara. Hey, Houston, Stephen, great. Okay, so I'm not talking only to myself. Good to hear. I'm Audrey, and I'll be keeping an eye on that chat box, so ask your questions throughout, and you will receive an email with a link to the recording of this webinar about an hour after, and you'll be able to claim one Scrum Alliance SEU and one PMI PDU after learning with us today. Our presenter today is Pete Oliver-Krueger. He's a lean agile expert, speaker, management consultant, and trainer specializing in the psychology of product development. His research over the past couple of decades has focused on scientifically proven techniques grounded in positive psychology, collaborative growth, and cross-cultural exploration. During today's webinar, he'll walk you through an actual rollout of Agile Transformation with related team techniques, assessment tools, and metrics you should be tracking. Good morning, Pete.
Good morning, Audrey, and good morning to everyone else out there. It's great to see a bunch of folks from throughout the United States and maybe more connecting in. We're having a fairly sunny day here in the DC area, and the winds have died down, so that's definitely a positive for us. So looking forward to getting out a little bit later with the dogs. All right, so what we're going to talk about today is a Agile team roadmap. This is a technique, exercise, a collection of processes that you can use with your teams that are kind of mapped out as maybe recommendations on a best practice for a rollout. And this itself came from working on multiple rollouts myself, working with a bunch of different teams, and the patterns that I started to notice in how I approached bringing new processes to teams and starting to get more teams to sort of buy into processes, and what those sort of patterns were that were kind of repeated from organization to organization. So first I want to start off with some polls and see if you have some similar problems to ones that I typically encounter with a lot of the people I work with. First one is the idea of maybe just having a lot of team members. So if you have maybe a larger business, a lot of team members, I'm going to hand it over to Audrey, and she's going to put a poll up to have you guys vote for what categories of size of organization you have.
Okay, polls up, and the choices are: if you're in a startup with 0 to 9 people, small business 10 to 99, medium 100 to 999, and large over 1,000, or exactly 1,000 actually. All right, we've got almost 75%, so we'll go ahead and wrap it. And we are closed. Here are the results.
All right, so we've got a few startups. About 20% of you are in small organizations, a quarter of you in medium, majority of you in large organizations from 1,000 and up. All right. There we go. Okay, next poll for you is how many product lines or team members do you have? So you'll see a few options there as far as do you just have one product, one team, or maybe one product, a couple, multiple teams, maybe multiple products, one team per product, or the last one is multiple products and multiple teams per product.
Since we already had a practice round, we'll be quicker to close this one. And just a few more seconds. Click, click, and close. Here are our results.
All right, so I see just a few, mostly multiple products. Yep, multiple products, multiple teams. All right, and that matches a lot. Now, the stuff that we're going to be talking about can be used really with just one team, but it really starts to come into play and helps with the management process when you are dealing with multiple teams, especially across multiple product lines. All right, so last one here is a couple of the different problems. So this one's going to be a checkbox, select as many problems as apply to you. These are a few different ideas out there that we've run into. And I'll let you go ahead and vote now, then we'll talk about them.
All right, the first one, we only have so many characters, so it says different flavors of Agile, including Agile doesn't work here. And then you can read through the rest. I guess pick your biggest problem. This is not a select multiple, it's just a select one. So the biggest problem you
Okay.
All right, we're slowing down. Final answers, and we're closing. So here are those results.
All right, different flavors of Agile, long releases, little to no metrics, less on the area of losing customers or layoffs. So good news for you guys. And although those may have been checked if there were multiple choice, but we will talk about all of those things. Great. So good to see what is out there that you guys are dealing with as well. So we run into these things all the time when we go in. So Agile, there's so many different places that are teaching Agile. Agile itself is an umbrella. There's so many different techniques from the Scrum world and the SAFe world, Scrum at Scale. We've got XP, we've got Kanban, and all of those things are valid ways to do Agile. But the problem is when we try to get teams pulling together, they have been trained and exposed in different ways. And we think that we have this common language, but when we actually come together, I may say something like sprint planning or even planning poker, and that can mean something completely different to different people in the room. So often what I end up doing with teams is to set sort of a baseline on terminology, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Another thing that a lot of customers are facing these days is maybe there's some disruption coming into your industry, or you may be facing just the customers starting to pare down. Usually connected with that is if the customers are starting to go away, then the executives may be facing some tough challenges talking about layoffs. Another thing that I see often is large release spans, where we have projects that are taking, we try to say releasing every month for Agile, and I find very few organizations that can do that. So if you're not doing that yet, don't worry. You're not too far off, but there are ways to do so. And then I find that typically the release schedule is around 3 months to 6 months for most organizations, although some organizations I've seen are up to a year or 2 years. One even had a 10-year release cycle, which I didn't really count as a release cycle, but that was an interesting case. Then little to no metrics. So we'll talk about the challenge of metrics, because especially when you're getting started, it can be really hard to pull super effective metrics. All right. As we go along, I'm going to talk about a case study. So this is an organization that I like to use because it is 3 sort of businesses in one, and it helps to sort of show that this can work in multiple different environments. So this one is a profit-based business. So they run product lines, they've taken income, and they use that income to pay for their stuff, for their employees, everything that they do. But they also operate as like a regulatory agency within the field that they work on. So they actually work across an entire industry, and they provide shared data between the different players in that industry. And they also act as a not-for-profit advocacy group. So their goal is not to make money and please shareholders. Their job is to create an environment that allows the participants in the industry to make their profits. They are also a global organization, and so they hit into a lot of different markets, and so it gives a chance for to see how this sort of impacts working in another continent or having to get onto a flight in order to talk to your customers versus being able to walk out your front door and be able to get customers. It also has a lot of external competitors, including Google, which is now moving into the space for this organization. And it also is being faced with disruption by startups. So it kind of hits all the different boxes there of a lot of the things that we typically see. Which is great for me as a case study, was not so great for them and all of the challenges that they were facing. So here are a few of the problems that they were working with when they brought us in to sort of work with them. They have these different flavors of Agile, including some people who were saying, Agile just doesn't work, or it's not going to work here. A lot of adaptations, we had this, we tried this, we needed to adopt it to our unique situation, so a lot of sort of different takes and understandings of what Agile means. Now they were facing this thing of losing customers because there was some of that disruption that was coming in. There were new platforms coming up, there were startups coming up with new things, and because they weren't able to release in fewer than 6-month cycles for some of the major products, they could release small individual features or updates and patches in less than 6 months. But the stuff that the startups were coming in and sort of displacing them was stuff that was being delivered by the startups in a quarter or a fraction of the amount of time that it was taking them to release stuff. So they really needed to speed up their ability to get stuff out the door. So to that end, they were starting a re-architecting project to create an API, both internally for their own stuff and to re-architect stuff to get rid of all the old code that was slowing them down. But that itself had started off with a projection of about 6 months to a year, and it was now going on 2 years, and the project still hadn't been completed. So they really needed to get that completed and finished. And there were similarly not a lot of metrics to go on. So the metrics hadn't necessarily been built in as we might do in a DevOps kind of culture. So it was a lot of this was coming back in and saying, how could we measure this team and start putting some metrics on it? So when I got into the organization, we started off with this idea of having 2 product teams, or 2 product lines. They were broken down. We had 2 teams for product A and 2 teams for product B, as well as an API team, which had 3 teams as part of it. And so that was all the players that we had to sort of start working with to do this initial Agile rollout. All right, I'm going to update this from problems to challenges because these are all things that we can deal with, all things that we can tackle, and we did. And there was one additional problem that popped in later, which was that it turns out that it wasn't just 2 product lines, an API team and 7 teams. It was actually going to turn out over time to be 7 product lines that had to be stood up, as well as 18 plus teams. So we started off by delivering for them an Agile team workshop. And we'll come back to the different topics here. So this is my way of doing agendas for my classes. I like to lay it out as a roadmap itself, laying out, kind of like a scaled Agile kind of implementation of having multiple iterations where each one is set for a break. So I find this very easy to follow, and this is also a great tool, and we'll talk about what this tool is later on when we're looking at our Agile team roadmap. But it's a great way to sort of see what's coming. This is all done in classes with the sticky notes, so as I go through, I can move things around and adjust them. But you'll see there's a lot of stuff and a lot of techniques in there, and so taking those techniques and being able to not only teach them, but then follow up with them in the class or follow up with them at work and make sure that the teams are doing these things as intended and executing on them was really important. And I want to say a little piece about that. If you've ever seen, there is the backwards bicycle video, and I play that in my classes. I'm not going to play that here, but the general sort of idea there, and I would definitely watch it at some point if you haven't seen it already, is that the idea is that when we learn something through a bias. We have this idea of what things are. It's just the way our brain works. Where our brains are pattern matchers. So as you start learning a new technique, you pattern match it against something that you've already done previously in your life, if you've got something similar. And so then when you start going into it and applying it in the workplace, you think you're doing the new technique, But usually you'll be pulling in a bunch of old techniques and a bunch of old ways of things that you used to do, and doing those instead, but think you're doing it in the new way. So the coaching becomes a really important part of the training process, to make sure that we clarify a lot of the misconceptions, and understand sort of where the original idea of the best practice came from. And once we teach it and then apply it and then fix it, that's usually when I give teams the freedom to then make some adjustments to it. I find that organizations oftentimes will make adjustments too quickly, before they even really understand what the original purpose of the exercise was. All right, so I'll talk about that in a little bit more later. So here was our plan for the rollout. So the idea was during the first month, we were going to have product line number 1, and we were going to put them through training. It was a 2-day training. It was 2 teams. I think it was larger than we could handle within a single class. So we actually ended up running 2 classes each of those 2 days. So that's 4 days of training within the month. That left me 3 more weeks to be able to do coaching with that team and help them to apply those exercises, do some things with them in their own space with their own backlogs. Fantastic. Second month, we brought in product line number 2. We started training them. So they also had 2 teams, a significant number of people. We had to do a couple trainings on that. So that took out a couple weeks. Then there was coaching for products teams 1 and 2. So I had to split that up between those 2 teams. So they got maybe 1 week or so of coaching per team, maybe 2 weeks for product line 2 and 1 week for product line 1. Then we got into the third month. We had the API team. So this was 3 teams. We actually had to do, I think we fit everybody into 2 trainings. But again, we're taking out basically the equivalent of a week for training. Then for the coaching, now everybody's getting just 1 week of coaching as a follow-up. You can start to see the pattern that's happening here. As you're doing these rollouts, the more teams that you start to bring online, the more coaches that you may need in order to get this done, as well as just the overhead of doing the training itself is going to take away from some of that coaching time. And so you really have to think about that process and how that feeds into things. Now, the extra problem they had on here is they had the budget to cover the training and they had the budget to cover coaching, but not necessarily 2 coaches. So I was faced with a rather interesting challenge of how do we keep onboarding more teams, keep doing the trainings, and keep doing all the coaching for all these organizations, even though I couldn't be there for every single one of those teams. So that became like the real problem to be solved in this rollout. And then this was the problem that came in after that, is the executives then came back around as we were into this 4th, 5th, and 6th months and said, hey, so how are we doing? We've been doing this Agile thing for maybe about 6 months now, and I'm looking to get a nice good return on my investment, so we should be rolling out a bunch of new products, and so that's all happening, right? And everybody's Agile and everything's great. And of course, there's only so much time in the day. So we had a few of the teams that were out first that were able to do a lot of their really great work. They got more coaching. They were really starting to take off. The second round teams were starting to build up. They were doing a good velocity, getting things through. And where it started to bog down was on the third team with the API team. They were still moving kind of slowly on things, and we found some techniques, which I'll talk about in the roadmap, which helped to unlock the fluidity for some of that stuff. When we talked about how can we report and show value, how can an Agile rollout show value back to the executives and let them know that their money is being well spent, we started looking at what are the typical Agile metrics that we have to do. So typically at the Scrum Master delivery team level, we're looking at a couple different velocities. So you might have a story count velocity, which is the number of you can do a story point velocity, which is you estimate each of the stories that you're working on, and then this is counting your total story velocity. But the issue with that is if once you get going into a steady rhythm, that story point velocity will tend to flatten out, and you'll know what your team's velocity is. So if you did 30 story points before, you'll do 30 story points after. So when the executives are looking at this in the metrics, they're tempted to look at this and say, well, they're doing 30 story points before, they should now be doing 32 story points or 35 story points. When will they get to 40 story points? That's not really how a story point velocity goes. So instead, what we introduced was a story count velocity, which shows that we are spending the same amount of time because we have a fixed number of people for a fixed amount of time. So the estimation is just helping us figure out how much work we can do within a sprint, within a 2-week period. So instead, what we're going to tell you is how many of these stories actually get churned out. And so for a 30 story point velocity, in the first few sprints, we might have churned out maybe 5 stories. But then for the same story point velocity, in the next sprint, we may have gone up to 6 stories. And then we might have gone up to 8 stories and maybe dropped down to 7 stories and then maybe get up to 10 stories. And so this is starting to show that flow that the executives are looking for, that there's definitely an increase in that. So one first thing about metrics is make sure that you're doing a story count velocity in addition to a story point velocity, because they're very different things. Now, where we do use a story point velocity is getting into this idea of predictability. So if we want to say when we sit down in sprint planning, we are going to complete 30 story points worth or 35 story points worth. We want to go back at the end of the sprint and check and see, did we get all 30 or 35 done, or did we do 25 or 20 story points? Because we can't do really good planning unless we get to the point where we say we're going to deliver this and then we do deliver this. Now, what we want to do is get your executives out of the habit of looking at these things and saying, this is definitely, or I need these 30 story points or these particular stories to come out, and instead get them looking at, we said that this amount of work was going to be this size, and in the end, it was this size, or this thing was more complex and this thing was less complex. So we want them to start thinking about this in terms of real world metrics, which is why we want 30 story points to be 30 story points from sprint to sprint. All right, next one, time to close impediments. So this is another one, since we know from our Kanban, our lean flow learning, that the more time that you spend on a task, or the more time it sits in a queue waiting to be worked on, then the slower our rollout is going to be. So anytime we have an impediment, anytime we have something that gets in the way, we want to track that, and then we want to fix those impediments as quickly as possible. The fourth one that a lot of teams do that I don't necessarily require of all teams, especially when I'm getting started, is automated code coverage. And we'll talk about that when we get into the roadmap a little bit more, and why I don't do that at the beginnings and when it does become important. But this is another one to think about for your teams as your basic Agile metrics that can do. So story count velocity, your story point velocity, make sure you compare that with the actual velocity to give your predictability, time to close impediments, and automated code coverage. Now over on the product side, we have definition of ready. That's usually my first metric. Does your team have a definition of ready? And has it been signed off by both the product team and the delivery team? Just so there's an agreed upon handoff point of what's necessary in order to accept something into the sprint. Then after that, typically I ask for 2 sprints worth of user stories to be ready. And to be ready, it means they have to fit that agreed upon checklist of their definition of ready. And then we also find that it's really good for the product teams to be mapping out, up to 3 months in advance of what they plan to be doing in the coming months. So that becomes sort of the product side metrics to begin with. All right, but if you've ever worked with an executive team, if you've ever had to go back and report on these things, you may give your metrics, you might have some really nice burn down charts, you can give some nice story count velocities, and they may talk with you about this for quite a while. But if you've ever mastered this with a team, it doesn't have to be every team, but even just like one team, you may start noticing a thing, which is that the executives will look at this and they'll say, okay, great, graph looks great. Okay, so you've shown me that this is a good story count velocity, but the product itself is still not making any more sales. We're still in the place where we're losing customers. We're still, struggling to fix the problems or reduce calls from the customer service desk. So the basic Agile metrics that most of us learn as the way to measure Agile, while being important for running a team, is not the same thing as being important for running a business. So we need a different set of metrics for how to run a business. Problem is, we can't do that right away, especially when we're first onboarding new teams. And so this is part of the thing that I have to do when I'm coaching for the executives and the management level, is talk about the fact that there's going to be certain metrics you're going to do in the beginning, and then you can add in more metrics that measure the business, but we have to sort of get through that first part. So that still leaves us stuck in this place that the executives asked us, which is, how do we know if we are making progress? If we're at risk of layoffs and losing customers and reduced revenue, they are, hey, great, you guys are doing Agile well, kudos to you, but I'm still going to have to lay people off. So we need to get to a point where we can really talk to the business model, where we can really talk to the profitability of the organization and be able to give them numbers and metrics dealing with that. Now, what those metrics should involve is going to be completely different from organization to organization. And that's why we don't see a lot of talk about, here is the one great metric that's going to measure your business. We see strategies for how to measure it. But I can't walk in as a coach and say, here, run these numbers, run these exercises, collect this data. I have to first know what your business model is. I have to know what your customers are like. And one of the things that I use as a way to help flesh out the importance of customers and the importance of who's going to buy versus who's not going to buy is using Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Now, we're used to what you see over on the right-hand side, which is a personal-based version of Maslow's hierarchy. It was developed by Abraham Maslow himself, and it sort of walks through the basic steps. And this has been used and built on by many times over the years. And finding out that people really, when they don't have the basics of like food, water, then that is all they can think about. Just surviving is all they can focus on. Once they are able to survive, and be able to have sort of the food, water, sleep, the basic necessities of life, then they start looking at security and safety. They want a roof over their heads. They want some kind of stability. They're looking for employment. They're looking for make sure they have those sort of resources. Once they have sort of the house and that safety net down, then you'll see people start to worry about relationships and start to deal with families and loves and relationships and really building on top of that. And then once people have like a really strong family life, then they might start looking to advance themselves in their careers or move further on. And we've all seen stories and examples of people who have been working on their careers and then the family life falls apart and then that kills the career. And so they all build on top of each other. And then Maslow put this idea of self-actualization on the top, which is to say that once all of those things below that are all stable, then you can really build on things having to do with culture and how you interact with the world and impact on the world and all these other sorts of things. And one thing I found is that this applies to organizations as well. It applies to your organization and it applies to the customers that you work with. So when we are dealing with sort of the physiological layer, that's kind of similar to your resources. Do you have enough of computers, websites, servers, software? Can you pay the employees that you need in order to get the work done? If you can't do those things, that has to be the first thing that gets solved. After that, we want to have a nice, steady sales mark on this. We want to have a nice flow of customers coming through, a good, steady sales team, so that we can pay for ourselves. If that is at risk, especially if you're in a place where you're looking at losing customers or looking at layoffs, that's basically a company dealing with a safety issue. that is the primary focus that you need to look at. And a lot of organizations are dealing with orange struggles, be it the organization that you're in or the organization that your customers may be in. And so the best metric to help out with that is to say, how can we build into the sales pipeline? And so you'll see a little bit later on, there's a bunch of techniques, and this is where a lot of lean startup comes in, that's really looks at how do we build a new business model that gives us a consistent income stream to be able to take care of our resources. And what I wanted to point out here is that comes before culture. I've been in multiple organizations, multiple places where you've got teams that are really trying to work on the positive psychology side, really trying to work on the culture side of things. And it's really, really good. And I really applaud that. But if they're not paying attention to the business model, that's where everything starts falling apart. And a great example of this is working with an organization. We were kind of almost all the way through this entire hierarchy, and we had everybody on board except I was going to say the CEO, but even the CEO was on board, but the head of the board of directors, the guy who owned the company, was not on board. And he was kind of letting the CEO on down run this organization, and then they got into a situation where there was some corporate espionage and some competition. They lost a really big contract, and the head of the board of directors jumped in right away and said, all right, fine. This Agile stuff is just not working. We're going to shut it all down, and I want to go back to our standard waterfall product message because when I was running the company, that's what worked. So that's kind of the thing that you're going to be facing. So if you don't have that safety net, that's the first thing that you need to focus on. And then we can start focusing on culture. And I've seen this pan out time after time. And the reason why is there's a set of research called spiral dynamics. This was research that was done across about 30, 40 years by a man named Claire Graves. And then his protege was Don Beck. Don Beck is most known for using these techniques with Nelson Mandela and helping him to roll out the first government post-apartheid. So this is history going back for quite a while, sort of looking at the different patterns of how people see the world and how people make decisions. And then a few other people have added into this thing to sort of be able to try to assess your work. What it really comes down to is our organizations kind of fall into these 6 kind of categories, although most organizations fall into the ones in the middle, red, amber, and orange. So purple is like your small town family store. It's mostly staffed by one family. That's their hiring policy, is to have more kids. Red starts to get into these first organizations that start to build up and hire outside. You still have, a family structure. The most popular example right now is Trump Enterprises and this idea that the kids take over, not the next person who was vice president or CEO. That's sort of the hallmark of a red level family business. The amber organization starts to get into corporate hierarchy, and in this level, those folks who show the best to sort of move up the hierarchy now run this. So we're into a place where we're sort of dealing with the highest paid person's opinion, the HIPPO principle. Then an orange organization is very much more metrics driven. It's very entrepreneurial. Usually the first metric that we follow is the money because of what we were just looking at as far as safety and security. Then we might broaden out from there and you start getting into an area that has a term called conscious capitalism. And so conscious capitalism is really looking at impact and mission, green companies, low profit companies, those sorts of organizations often fit into that green tier. And then there's a new thing out there called teal. This isn't a presentation on teal. But one of the things that gets missed on teal when that gets discussed is that teal is the thing that makes us aware that there are levels in the first place. And so what the Agile Team Roadmap is built on is this knowledge that our organizations and the people within those organizations think about different things at different times. And so we can't treat all of our teams the same way. So you have to be able to identify which team is using which mindset, and then could I grow that mindset to the next level and get them thinking about things. So for example, an amber organization. So if I'm in a place where we're in the HIPPO principle and whoever's at the top decides what's going on, my focus there is to get them to start thinking about metrics, to start measuring their customer impact, to start doing, looking at business models so that they start making decisions based on the numbers and the metrics and scientific method instead of making decisions on who's in power. Now, if we're back down one level, and we're in a red organization, what typically happens there is you have teams that aren't working together. They're very disparate. They're on their own things. They're on their own backlogs. Each team may have like a product manager, and whatever the product manager says is what goes. And so for those teams, what I'm trying to get them to practice working together. So I want them to get to be an Amber organization. And I don't mind that there is a person that the higher you go up the hierarchy, that's the opinion that we're going to go with. Because what's most important at that level is to get people coordinated and working together. And this is really where the scaled Agile different ways shine, because they're really looking at how do we get teams of teams to coordinate towards a common goal for the entire organization. So one of the things that I found out was as I would roll out different techniques, some would land with some organizations and some would not. So I started mapping those out over time, and I started noticing that there was a pattern, that there were certain techniques that worked really well in Amber organizations and certain techniques that didn't work well until people understood the scientific method and how to do data-driven decision-making. So I found that it was really hard to introduce any idea of going out and talking to customers to an organization that was at a red or an amber level. Likewise, it was really hard to get, DevOps, automated deployments, and full automated testing working in those hierarchical, places, because you'd have somebody high up in the chain who was not responsible for the actual delivery, who was making decisions and choices on we're going to work on this and not work on this, and I need my product thing because I need an income stream, so therefore we are not going to work on DevOps because that's a technology thing. And so what I needed to do is to get those people realizing that the DevOps, when you watch the metrics, the DevOps produces better product outcomes and better business models. So you're starting to see how these sort of things interplay, hopefully, and pull these things around. And coming back around to the Agile Team Workshop that we were running with the teams, the correlation you may see is, so when I teach this, the first day is typically the exercises and the techniques from the red level. So first we're going to just talk about the basics of running Agile. Do we have a backlog? Do we know how to do spikes? Are we doing burn down charts? Are we putting in acceptance criteria? And are we doing retrospectives? Then I'm going to come back in, and day 2 is then building on top of these techniques and starting to look at some of the more advanced stuff. And I put a little spattering of things from amber and orange levels into the class. But what I expect is teams to first make sure that they can master day 1, make sure that they can master all the basic Agile skills, the baseline Agile skills. And then I want them to build on top of that and start looking at team coordination skills and then adding in metric skills. All right. I'm actually going to take a pause right there because I've gone through a lot of different things and see if anybody has any outstanding questions or if they got confused at any point, any things I can clarify.
Pete, we do have a couple of questions. One was, back on your metrics slide, can Jira capture these, which were number of stories and velocities?
Yes. So the answer is yes, some of them more easily than others. I probably will do a webinar on ways to set up Jira for Agile success in the future. And feel free to follow up with us at info@LitheSpeed.com for more details on this. It's a longer answer, but it is possible. And I'll say the things that you can do pretty quickly is story points velocity and look at predictability, because those are built in. But you have to do a lot of extra configuration, especially to get to time to close impediments. You have to create new task types in order to do that. And to do story count velocity, you have to buy an add-on to Jira. I have not found a good way to do that out of the box.
Awesome. And Pete, I have some good news. In March, we're going to have a Jira metrics webinar. It's just not up yet, and you're not the one doing it.
Oh, hey,
So great.
fantastic.
So stick around for March. And then we've got a couple of just clarifications on what are some things. What is meant by double aces?
Haha. All right, I will get to that later. And actually, I did a webinar on this. Maybe you know off the top of your
Yep.
head, Audrey, but
Yeah, if you
um,
head to our, you'll probably get a link to the recorded webinars page or just search around LitheSpeed.com and there's a whole webinar on that.
yeah. So generally, it's a positive psychology approach that talks about giving feedback, and that we have to appreciate the person that we are talking to first, clarify any questions before we can then offer any enhancements to their ideas. And so that goes by appreciation, clarify, enhance, ACE, is where the double aces comes from.
Great. And then we have micro ace and decision tree, question mark, question mark.
Nah, okay. Those are other ways of doing the double aces. So a micro ace is a management technique where you build in all three of those statements as you are talking with folks as a way to help really build people up and grow understanding. And I think I talk about that in the webinar on double aces. And then the other one, be happy to follow with you afterwards. I think the description for that last one is just the decision tree is too long to really go into. We would waste too much time here.
All right. And then before you came up with the roadmap and activities, did you do any assessment?
Yes, we did a bunch of assessments. We started by doing check-ins with the teams. We started by me observing with of what they're doing, coaching them on things, sort of building out a map of what all the different teams were currently doing. We also were running these metrics, so we tried to stand up these metrics in the beginning and look at the velocity and the counts and the burn down charts, as well as burn up charts, and looking at a bunch of these different things. So we ran a bunch of those metrics to begin with, and that was how we found out that that data did not satisfy the executives.
Right. And then do you use any maturity model to track improvement?
This really has become the maturity model that I use. So I know that there are a bunch of them out there. Used to do, I graduated from Carnegie Mellon, so I was into CMMI for a while, and sort of left that one behind. There's a bunch of other ones that are out there as well, but this has really kind of replaced all of those. I can show value for an executive team and for the folks who are doing it through this, and it also becomes a way to really just build on practice. So I like doing this instead.
All right, and that's it for now on the questions.
All right. Okay, so I want to give an example to describe how I approach rollouts of process to Agile teams. Imagine that you have a brand new hire that you're just bringing in, and it's time to go to lunch. So if we were to ask, where do you want to go to eat? They're not going to know, because especially if they don't live around there, they've never been to any of the restaurants. It's their first day. So what do? Naturally, we get a bunch of people together, hopefully, take them out to eat and show them where some of the places are. So we want to walk them through, here's where this food is. If you like, vegetarian food, go here. If you like Italian food, go here. If you just want a burger, go here. If you want some Indian food, there's a great buffet down the street. Those are the things that we're going to walk them through to begin with. Then, after they're there for a little while, then they might start looking at making their own choices on stuff, and we can give them sort of a map of the area where we sort of roll out a bunch of these things, or we look at the different places, and all right, if you want to go there, if you want to go here, here's how you do this. Here's good directions. Don't go down this street because it's a dead end, even though it doesn't show on the map. We're trying to give sort of tips and tricks on how to do things and how to be more efficient. And then only after that, after they sort of know the area, they've been to a few different places, we've gone to places together, then could we actually sit down and they could, say, hey, where would you like to eat? And like they pick a restaurant Or they may come up with a new place. Hey, I found this great place that we never went to yet. Would you like to go try out this Thai food? And so then you might go explore that thing. The same thing needs to be done with an Agile team. So the first thing that I do is bring them in and we set a baseline of certain practices. Then once I know that we're all talking the same language on that baseline, then I'm going to give them some tips and tricks and allow people to pick and choose and start to develop their own cadence on things. And then I'll let them come in and then decide what the Agile team rollout should be. And it's very important to have those 3 steps when you are standing up new teams or you're bringing a bunch of teams together, reorganizing, hiring a bunch of people, or maybe doing, a expand, to add a new product line or anything like that. Because each one of those disruptions, trying to get all those people working together, you have to make sure that they're coordinated first. And then you can sort of build on top of it. So I start off with a set of techniques that I call Agile Team Roadmap Level 1. And the goal is to basically do a quick assessment. I'll start by going through and watching each of the teams do these things. So I might visit a Agile release planning or backlog grooming session that they're doing. And if they're doing all of these things and they're doing it consistently, I'll just go ahead and I'll give them a 4 or a 5 in each of these boxes. This is a spreadsheet that I run. I started here. I also have a version of this that we loaded up in a Confluence application. And we started off actually, so this is a little bit of learning that we had. We started off with a yes, no. Are you doing these things, yes or no? What we found out was that wasn't enough. And really what we needed to be looking at was how often are you doing that and how frequently are you doing this? Now, there's certain techniques that people may not be even ready to start working on yet. So you'll see those have sort of blank spaces in here. And there may be some places where they know they want to start working on it, or they know they should, but they're not. And so that's like workflow maps. You'll see there's a red box there that has a 0 in it. So the cautionary stuff, really 1, 2, 3, as long as you're working on it, yay. That's what I want to see. I want to see that you're working on it, you're applying it, you're trying to practice the rules. Once you get it to the point where you're about 80% there, it goes green. And at that point on, whether you go for 100%, that's entirely up to you. So the general idea with the roadmap and working with teams is you go through each of these techniques, and I want to see you basically qualify out of level 1. I want to see this go green across the board. So that doesn't mean you have to be perfect. Just getting to 4s or 5s, maybe 1 or 2 3s throughout this board means that you're doing good enough, you satisfy the criteria for it. Now, there's one thing very particular in how I picked the techniques for this particular level, and that is that I think really all of these techniques are things that if you just do them, you'll understand why we do them. So I run into a few things from time to time where I've got teams that are asking me to say, well, why do I have to do planning poker? And why do we have to do retrospectives? I don't think it's necessary for us to have separate test environments. And they'll push back on a lot of these things. And one of the reasons why I sort of classify this in the red category is I've literally had to spend hours, days, and weeks trying to convince teams that they need to do these techniques, and they still will not do it. So what I've started doing with techniques at this level is I just say, just do it. Sit down, I'm going to teach you the rules, do it according to the rules as we lay out, and I have a glossary, I have descriptions for them, we walk through it, we do it, and then these techniques are specifically designed with aha moments. So for example, planning poker is a big one. We walk through, I give you the rules. They include things like pull the card, hold it to your chest, don't show anybody yet. Only when everybody has pulled all of their cards, then Scrum Master counts down 3, 2, 1, flip all the cards at the same time. And that is there because if you start to pull the card and show it or say, oh, I definitely think that's a 5 before somebody else has pulled the card, our brains can't help but fix it. And so they'll, if I was going to pull an 8, I'm like, well, he thinks it's a 5 and he's the head, he's the dev lead and it's probably a 5, and I'll go ahead and adjust that myself. And when we normalize before the cards get flipped, we don't do what planning poker is designed to do. Planning poker is not an estimating technique. Planning poker is a great way to flush out all of the unknowns and all of the questions about a user story before you work on it. So when you have one person has a 3 and one person has an 8, we ask questions like, 3, would you be willing to come up to a 5? Why or why not? And 8, would you be willing to come down to a 5? Why or why not? And they start saying, well, we have to do this, 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 and this. And the other person is like, no, we don't. We already have the test for that. And they start debating back and forth about the complexity of the user story. That's the purpose of planning poker. So I usually have to it's so hard to explain, but once we do it and the first team throws up an 8 and a 3 or a 13 and a 2, and they have to explain why one person is a 13, the other person is a 2, and all of a sudden these things come to light that people weren't thinking about, there's a snap, and then people get it, and they're like, oh, now I understand planning poker. And a lot of that is the problem of, a lot of the, sometimes the techniques aren't taught very well, and that's on us, as Agile trainers and coaches. So I put in a list of descriptions and a glossary for each of these techniques in the Agile team roadmap to sort of help teams to look at these things. But each one of those exercises is one of those types of things where you do a thing, after you do the thing, then you understand why we do the thing. Now that you understand why we do the thing, you don't maybe have to do planning poker every single time, or maybe you adjust it and you do small, medium, large, or maybe you do fingers, or maybe you can make some adjustments, but you have to first understand that it's about the conversations, and then you can choose not to do planning poker. So that's sort of the theory behind level 1 stuff. Let me take a quick pause right here and see if anybody has any questions on level 1.
Pete, the question is, we can't see it very well. It's very small. Will you zoom in for us or go to the Excel? And then is there a possibility to get this template shared?
Yes, we will make it available. Here we go, zoomed in. Thank you for the reminder.
Perfect. Yep.
All right, so typically we'll have like products over here and then our teams. I'll label the colors. So if this team is working on level 1, this team has moved up to level 2. That allows me to quickly see where teams are. And so here you can see that we've got like our team 1 has cleared out and they're 4s and 5s across the entire row. And then our teams 2 and 3 are still trying to close out some certain sections. So we've got backlog grooming, user stories, spikes, workflow maps, story splitting. All of those things can be done without any prior experience, with some training. In planning, we have planning poker and burn down charts. In the development area, we have daily stand-ups. In testing, we're looking at acceptance criteria, being able to do testing inside the sprint instead of in a sprint after the fact. Bug tracking. Under operations, we're looking at done. So not only did it get signed off by the product owner, but was it actually deployed to the customers? And setting up test environments separate from development environments. And then under the HR category, we've got the idea of retrospectives and are you doing performance reviews?
Okay, and we've got, we want a little deeper dive into what is done tracking.
I think I want to give the quickest answer, which is to get sign off, we have to test it. We probably even have to do some integration testing to verify that this is what the product owner asked for. But that doesn't mean it has been deployed to the customer. And at that point, it may go sit in a queue. And it may not go out until 3 other user stories are ready, and then all 4 of those user stories will go out together. So at that point, you no longer are able to track the time accurately as a development team. So your metrics might go off. And so we find this when we're doing sort of burn down charts, that if people measure the end of their burn down chart by deployed to the customer, what they're actually doing is building in a bunch of wait time that their teams have no control over. And so burn down charts start to feel impossible because they built it, the product owner signed off on it, but nobody's deployed it to production yet because we're waiting on X, Y, and Z. So done tracking is this idea that we are just going to track burn down charts to the end of product owner sign off, but we want to keep track of it. Did it get deployed to production? If somebody come back and said, hey, stuff from sprint 3, how much of that actually made it to our servers and to our customers? We can pull up a list and say, all right, so these 5 stories made it, and this one is still waiting on something else before it can be released. That's done tracking.
Great. I know we're running low on time, but we've got a really quick question just on the sprint planning. Kind of just sprint planning, question mark, maybe how do you track that, or what are we tracking there? Or maybe it's missing.
So for planning in level 1, what I really just want to do is that you pick a bunch of stories to work on. You do planning poker so that we can discuss the stories before we work on them, as I was describing before. And then the burn down charts of really just trying to look at when did those stories get done? Did we get them done? Did we tick off a couple stories in the first couple days of the sprint? A couple more by the end of the first week, a couple more in the middle of the next week, and then finish off the rest, at the end of the second week? Or did all of those stories stay open through the first week and all the way to the second week, and then everything got closed at the end of the sprint? Those are the things that we want to know. How we solve the problem of everything being closed at the sprint is really more of a level 2 activity, but we can at least start with tracking that information and collecting it. And then as we look at level 2, then we'll see things in more detail. So let me go ahead and switch over to that, unless there's one more urgent question out there.
Let's save them.
All right. So level 2 is going from, and I call the first one your Agile baseline, foundational techniques, because level 2 is goal-based. Management changes at level 2. So once teams have tested out and said, we are doing all of these basic things, we understand it, we have a shared common language about things. Now level 2 is about working together. And at this point, management, I tell the folks who are in management, don't go in and tell them this is what you have to do. These are the techniques that you have to do. This is what you have to deliver. Your job now in level 2 is to switch your expectations. Now I want you to give them goals, and these are business model goals. We want to see an increase in customer usage. We want to see an increase in sales. We want to see a decrease in number of people calling the customer service desk. Give those kinds of goals that have to do with the business model, with the product model, with the safety net level of stuff to your teams, and then let the teams come up with ways to meet those goals. So that's what level 2 is all about. So to do that, there's a bunch of techniques that you can do to break things down. In the design category, there's prototyping, and there's actually 2 different types. So if you're an API team, you don't have a UI, for example, but you can prototype the data. So you can just open up a Word document and type in what the code would look like, send it to a customer and say, if I sent you this data packet, would you be able to use it? Or if you sent me this, if I asked you to send the request in this format, how easy or how hard would that be to do? So you can do prototyping with data as well as prototyping with your user interfaces and be able to put that in front of customers before you write any code. Likewise, we might bring in some things, EWSJF. So this is weighted shortest job first. I tack on an E from the Lean Startup training, which is basically looking at whether or not you talk to any customers about this project. Can we do some MVP designs? We don't have to do the entire thing yet. Let's break it down into 1-month increments. We're going to build this thing for the first month, that thing for the second month. So that allows us to start building out a roadmap. So what are we doing for the next few months as far as our MVPs, and then what are our guidelines for the next few bits after that? We can start tracking some customer metrics on this. So metrics, this is what I was talking about in the beginning. Our Agile metrics don't help the executives. But by the time a team clears level 1 and gets to level 2, now they can actually start giving quality metrics to the executives. They can now design metrics themselves. And so that's what I started asking teams to do in level 2. We can start pulling in some of the elements of DevOps. We can start doing more automated testing and try to get to 100% in sprint testing and doing a lot more sort of automation stuff. That gets into level 2. Let me jump to level 3 real quick, and then I can leave it open for questions, and I can stick around for anybody who has any further questions. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on level 3 because not a lot of teams get here, but this is where you really get into full DevOps implementation, And this is where you really get into a lot of lean startup and metrics-based decision-making and design. Now, what's important about this from the management standpoint is that the managers need to again adjust their expectations. On level 2, they gave the teams goals, and the teams then told them how to get to this point. Once you've cleared level 2 and you can deliver on those goals given by management, on level 3, management now asks you, all right, what should be the goals? What do you think the product should be doing? And you start bringing the teams into the discussion about this. So with the case study team that I worked with, we ended up having, by the end of last year, we had 3 teams that were working at that level 3 and actually talking with the executive team on strategy for product. We had another tier of teams, probably about 4 or 5, that were on level 2, and they were being given API goals, and they were really working on driving and meeting those API goals. And then the rest of the teams were working on level 1 and the baseline and really practicing their techniques and just focusing on the base metrics that we looked at early on. So that's sort of the tier building on this. And the last thing I'll show is this is the glossary I was talking about as far as questions that will help you to guide your teams as far as whether or not you're doing what's intended for each of the practices. And there's ones for level 2 and level 3. All right, so that's the Agile team roadmap. Happy to follow up with anybody afterwards. I'll stick around if there's any questions that people want to focus on right now. And I'll hand it back to Audrey.
Great. We'll wrap up our official webinar as people's calendar is probably dinging at them. So thank you so much for joining us today. If you're in the DC area, we hope you'll consider joining our annual conference and job fair called Lean Plus Agile DC. That's coming up May 15th. And we also have some new classes in the area. Pete's going to be teaching Safe for Government in April, and we also have Safe DevOps available now. Finally, our Agile Leadership Academy, which is Scrum Alliance Certified Agile Leadership, is March 11th and 12th. And it's a pretty unique program. We have a site visit to a mature Agile organization and some networking and ongoing mentorship with that program. So let us know if you have any questions about this webinar or anything else at info@LitheSpeed.com. And you'll be getting 2 emails from us, one from GoToWebinar, which will have the recording, and a second one from me later today with the Excel template, and some other resources that we talked about. Anything else, info@LitheSpeed.com. And then Pete will move into some questions that have piled up over here. Let's see. One insightful non-question from Janet. She was explaining that done means it has to go through integration and security, any other stage gating process. Basically, it's the last step before it goes into production. Everything has to be done, not just done by the development/Agile team. So that was in response to someone else's question earlier.
Great description.
Yep. So Pete, how frequently do we have to do this Agile roadmap assessment for new teams/Agile adoption teams?
Yes. I have the teams self-assess on basically the end of every sprint. So part of the retro is the Scrum Masters go back through and sort of look at what the teams did previously and see if they increase their performance and update their numbers. We will also have them focus on maybe 1 or 2 techniques to work on for the next upcoming sprint, and they even highlight those cells in the Excel spreadsheet with blue so that the management knows that this is what they plan to work on. So we're not going to try to improve the other scores right now, but we are going to try to improve these. And then once a month, we would have communities of practice. We had one for the Scrum Masters. You can have one for dev teams. You can have one for product teams. And what we would do there is we would have basically, it started off with me just doing the assessments for everybody, but with as many teams as we had, it just was not sustainable. And so what we did was after somebody cleared level 1, then we knew that they understood that level, and then they could then vote basically in a kind of like a jury of their peers on the other folks. And so teams would come in to these community of practice each month, and they would sort of present their case and say, this is what we did over the last month. We had 2 sprints, we did this, and present some artifacts and saying, this is why we think we are at level 4 or level 5 or maybe level 3, and then their peers would then vote and say, and we would take the average score, and the average score would then be entered in for them. So we would come back and check that assessment officially once per month.
Okay, and then a question from Joe that's been waiting a while. How do you respond to teams that have been doing their own brand of Agile and think they haven't mastered and rebuild as an Agile team? P.S. They are not following the practices.
Really? Oh, so surprising. Here is the way that I've found to tackle it, and kind of the only way that you can tackle it, is you sit down and you stop telling them what to do and you start asking them, what are your problems? It's the only way I've sort of been able to get through with teams that are doing that. You have to sort of find the personal motivation that's in there. This is also the same principle that the double ACEs is built on. If we understand why they're struggling and what their problems are, then I can pull out a technique, and usually I'll go to level 1 techniques, things that they've skipped over or that I know that they're not quite doing right. And I'll say, hey, so that problem that you're having, that you're really struggling with, is because you're not researching first, for example, before you execute on these things, and that you should research, have a time-boxed amount of research. And that time-boxed amount of research is a spike. So first, just schedule out all your spikes, take care of all your research, and then go off and do your development. Don't try to do it all as one big amorphic task. So that's an example of a way that I would introduce spikes to a team that's not doing spikes based on the problem that they've had. So then you go to the next problem that they have and find a technique that fixes that, and just keep going through that. And I find that after you do that about 2 or 3 times successfully with level 1 techniques, especially because the level 1 techniques are designed so that after you do them, you realize why you should be doing them. That usually that is enough to convince teams, or at least the majority of the people on the team, that they really didn't get Agile now, they're getting it now better, and that they should probably go back and finish off that row and make sure they understand the other techniques.
All right, thank you. And we have one more question, so if anyone has a final question, stick it in quickly. And if not, Pete, our last question is done testing done after the specific sprint?
Typically. I'll give the example from SAFe and Scaled Agile because I think it's the clearest, but there are other schools of thought that deal with this as well. But if you think of a scaled environment, at the end of the sprint, the team does their demo, they do integration testing on that sprint, they get all that code working together, and they release that package. And then the teams will coordinate from team to team if there's multiple teams on a product line. And they might have to do a bunch of UAT testing and customer testing after that is done to make sure that that is set up, and then the environmental stuff is done. So there's always this oh God, it's like a waterfall, but I really didn't want to say the word waterfall. But it is this thing until you get to fully automated testing, which is what the DevOps goal is. You're going to close out the stuff in your current sprint. Then you're going to integrate that from team to team, and then you're going to take care of extra stuff that needs to be done in order to deploy that out to a production environment. So yeah, that usually happens after the sprint is done.
All right, thank you. We do have 2 more questions that came in. I think these are pretty good ones. So Todd asks, where is the best place to recover from a bad start in a large corporation? How do you overcome time pressure, milestone due dates, etc. from a PMO when you have teams that instinctively respond to the pressure?
Mm-hmm. So that's a more nuanced answer. The easiest answer is you have teams do level 1 until they've mastered the techniques, and then you can really focus on performance and fitting into the business model. But we all know the reality doesn't match the ideal. So in the real world, as we sort of tackle some of these things, I'll focus on what is the biggest, again, problem. But I'll start with what's the biggest problem for the product team? What's the biggest business model problem? So what are they trying to solve? And so then I'll drill down maybe from an orange level technique and say, so if the biggest problem is that we're doing a lot of rework, for example. That's probably a design problem. So I'll go look at level 2 design, and I'll have them do user interface prototyping or data interface prototyping, or maybe some MVP design depending on that, so that we can start doing an iterative approach, for example, on the design. And if they're really struggling with that, then I'll go back down to level 1 design techniques and say, so you're really just struggling with the prototyping and the MVPs because you've never done a workflow map. So let's do a workflow map exercise. And so then I go back down to level 1. And so then we walk them through the workflow map exercise, and they're like, oh, now I get it. And I'm like, great, yeah, and this is how you do the MVPs off of the workflow map. And now here's the steps in here where you do the user interface prototyping. So I'll typically go to like a level 2 because that's focused on the business level. If they're struggling with that technique, then I'll go find out what level 1 techniques are missing that are preventing them from doing the level 2 technique, which are preventing them from hitting their metrics.
Alrighty. So we will wrap up with one final question that is, as a consultant, I see a pushback sometimes on these meetings as it seems like there are too many meetings, complaining, how do we solve this?
Got another great exercise that I did in the 10-minute one, Agile DC from a couple years ago, a card game I put together. That's the history of Agile software. That really sort of encapsulates in 4 rounds of a card game what lean means, and how you can get rid of waste and how you can improve things. Because you have to, I call it slowing down to speed up. You have to spend a little bit more time to make some changes to your process to get rid of the points of waste. And once you can do that, then the whole thing speeds up. And it's through that process of learning something new and getting better that you start to get back that time, and that you start building on these things. If we hold off on learning on a new technique until we get our feet underneath of us, we will never get our feet underneath of us. You must leave that space, and that's why retrospectives are so important. I'll even say teams skip the retrospective and instead spend an hour, each sprint, or 2 hours doing some work to prepare you to go faster. That's going to be one of your most important things. I may have deviated from the question. Let me check back and see if that answers the question.
Pete, I think it did, because I feel like that was a very inspirational answer, and I like to leave this on a very positive note.
All right.
All right, if you do have any more questions for Pete, you can send them to info@LitheSpeed.com. And thank you so much, Pete, for your time and expertise today. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. Hope everybody has a great day.
Have a great day. Thanks for joining us.
All righty, bye-bye.
Bye.